Okay, it's almost 4 p.m. now. Um, and okay. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to CHLR. Center for Historical and Literary Research, New Delhi, is an organization that is run by two young scholars who have dedicated their lives to history and literature. Today, we meet here for yet another episode of lecture series from the pages of history. Today is a very special episode on the occasion of 167th birth anniversary of Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. We have usually read and heard his poems and know of him as India's most cherished poets, but seldom do we hear about his short stories. Today we have with us a celebrated professor who would throw ample light upon the hidden aspects of Rabindranath Tagore. Professor Debarati Bandyopadhyay hails from West Bengal and has had a teaching career of more than 25 years now. She is in the English department of Vishwabharati University, Shanti Niketan, and has authored a very famous book called Rabindranath Tagore, A Life of Intimacy with Nature, The Untold Story of Emergency. Welcome to CHLR, Professor. Over to you now.
Thank you, Vidushi, for your wonderful introduction and the invitation that preceded that. They are wonderfully worded, and I thank you again for that. And today I'm going to speak about Rabindranath Tagore's a part of his life, actually, in the sense that when we begin to talk about the 25th of Vaishak, which is today, we talk about the birth moment of this great poet. But today we are not going to talk about him as a poet only. We are going to find out certain unknown aspects of his life in terms of the short stories. And I would also bring in references to his letters, a few of his letters written during a particular period of his life. So, in this sense, we all know that he was born in Kolkata in 1861, and then he was a part of the great illustrious Tagore family. We all know about these details. What we perhaps do not know about is one particular phase of his life beginning in the late 1880s, which is in 1889 actually, when he was sent by his father, the great sage Maharishi Debendranath Tagore, to the eastern and northern part of Bengal. It was an undivided Bengal in the 1889 year that I am talking about. And at that point of time, they had extensive land holdings in this part of the country. And he was sent as the zamindar, the representative of the zamindar, his father. Zamindar would mean the landowner, and he was collecting taxes, collecting the revenue due to the landowner, as well as looking at the place, because this was his first visit to the place, in the sense that he had been to Kolkata, he had been to England, he had been to even Shantiniketan, which was later to become his workplace. But he had not been to this part of the world. And what he found very important for his own growth and the growth of his thought was that here he found people who were completely dependent upon nature. Here he found people, farmers, peasants, riots, who were completely vulnerable in the sense that they depended on nature for everything. One drought, one flood, and they were destroyed, utterly destroyed. They starved to death. And people would be lost in the floods. We will soon see how this affected him. Now, from a person who was a poet only, from a person who was thinking of the world of literature, culture, songs, dance drama, etc., that was the atmosphere that he was living in earlier. And from this atmosphere, suddenly he is put in a place where he knows nothing about collecting taxes or revenues or anything like that. And at the same time, we find that he had just one kind of an exposure to problems of other people, so to say. And that was in 1885 when he learnt about an extensive drought going on in the western to mid part of Bengal. And in his society, most of the people were completely unaware of this. So what he did was, on 12th April 1885, he was addressing a forum, and there he told the audience that, look, this is at the doors of our own house, and these are the hungry people. They are our compatriots. They are the people who are actually starving and hankering for a handful of rice. And in contrast, we are celebrating things in a grand way. Now, in this sense, he asked for their donations. Of course, first he had donated whatever he could, which was a lofty sum at that time, 500 rupees, and then he asked for others' help. And at the same time, he promised something which was very important. He actually proposed to rehabilitate and relocate all these people, all the starving population, to the Tagore family estate in the Sundarbans. That is something that we learn about in terms of what Hamilton would do and Hamilton had done for the local people, etc. But we don't usually remember the contribution that Tagore proposed to make in this context as well. So that was his one encounter with poverty, drought, etc., we can say. The other thing is, when in 1889 he had gone to this part of Bengal, he found that he had ample time. He was working very busily for the zamindari, or the landowners' property rights and things like that. But at the same time, he had a lot of time during the evening left in his hands. And at that point of time, he wrote 100 and more than 100 letters to his niece primarily. Now, this niece is also a very important figure in his life story and in our Indian history as well, because she happened to be the daughter of the first Indian ICS officer. Indians were not earlier permitted to become a part of the prestigious Indian civil services. But at this point of time, he was the first, Satyendranath Tagore. His second eldest brother was the first one to do it. And the daughter I'm talking about, the niece I'm talking about, is Satyendranath's daughter, Indira. It happened that he wrote these letters to primarily to her, to other people as well. And the letters that he had written to her, she actually wrote back. And at the same time, she collected these letters and sent them back to her uncle. And he found that he would share. Later on, her brother translated these Bengali letters into English according to the wishes of Tagore himself. And it happened that these letters give us an indication of what kind of a experience he was undergoing during this point of time. What we learn is, he says, for example, a letter from 10th May 1893, when he says, I feel a great tenderness for these peasant folk, our riots, big, helpless, infantile children of Providence. When the breasts of Mother Earth dry up, they're at a loss what to do and can only cry. And their vulnerability touched his heart, but that is not the only thing that he was talking about. He was saying that, look, there is a terribly hard thing. This is the same letter, 10th May 1893. They say a terribly hard thing who assert that the division of the world's production to afford each one a mouthful of food, a bit of clothing, is only a utopian dream. All these social problems are hard indeed. Fate has allowed humanity such a pitifully meager coverlet that in pulling it over one part of the world, another has to be left bare. So, what he meant possibly was that in terms of economics, in terms of the social problems, in terms of politics as well, there was exploitation. There was British exploitation, there was exploitation by a part of the Indian society, which was inflicted upon, so to say, other parts of the same population. Some people had the rights, some people had the possibility of doing such things to others. And in this situation, he understood that he needed to do something. Now, later on, he went on the basis of this experience, he later on created cooperatives with his own money, even this Nobel Prize money. A large part of it had gone to this kind of an activity in Shilai Dahapatishar, Kaligram, etc. These places where he was at this point of time from 1889 to the middle of the 1890s, so to say. So, yes, this period was a formative period in his life, as I say, and he was trying to find out what could be done for them. Now, other than practically what he did as a social, I wouldn't say reformer, but almost as a social activist, what he could be said as a story he could tell is he had created the university in Shantiniketan. He went on to create Sriniketan as a complimentary gesture, in the sense that it is not enough, according to him. It was not enough, according to him, ever. If you could just think of how studies, how university education would form a proper human being. The other part that was required, according to him, was to do things for the villagers who were dying due to malaria, cholera, etc., who were again starving in one remote part of Birbhum, about whom nobody was bothered, least of all the British government. So yes, in during this particular period in the 1890s, early 1890s, we find that he is writing to his niece that the river has. This is a story of a flood. The river has entered our land. The farmers are heaping their boats with unripe paddy in the hope that later on maybe some grains would be found to be ripe, and that is all their means of survival. So he said it is very ironical. He was talking about nature earlier or something. He would worship nature, which would give him a sense of serenity, perhaps. And now he's saying the supplication of hundreds of thousands of wretched, inoffensive creatures does not seem to get anywhere. It continues to pour, the river continues to rise, and no relief seems to be forthcoming from any quarters. Of course, he did whatever he could as the local landowner, but at the same time, it shattered him in a way to look at these people trying desperately to survive but not managing to do it anyhow. We learn from his son. His son Rothindranath was later an illustrious figure, a very industrious man, in the sense that he was after Tagore's death, uh, he was at the helm of our Vishwabharati, the university, so to say. And Rothindranath looked back and wrote in his memoirs, which is entitled On the Edges of Time, published in 1958. He wrote about this period. He wrote, in spite of his heavy literary work, father did not neglect his managerial duties. Every morning he would go through the accounts, hear reports from the staff, and dispose of important correspondence. But the most important, interesting function for him was to meet the tenants, hear their complaints, and settle disputes. He did not treat them in the traditional manner. He talked with them freely, and they too felt so much at ease with him that they would tell him about their land, their families, and their personal affairs. Father had made known that any tenant who wanted to see him could go straight to him. No officer was to interfere with this inherent right of the tenant. And we learn from Krishna Kripalani, one of the biographers, one of the most prominent biographers of Tagore, that during this period, this is what must have happened. Many of these stories were suggested by some scene or incident or character he observed while he lived in his houseboat on the river Padma. The houseboat too was named Padma. The genesis of some of these stories is referred to in the letters he wrote during the period. He sees something and he goes on to write a story about it. Now, Tagore went on to write about 100 short stories and ushered the era of modern short stories in Bengal in a way. What we find from his short stories is, I'll just give three or four instances in order to illustrate my point. And I am trying to talk about a particular period when he was undergoing this transformation quite visibly to himself. He notes on 19 December 1892, he was writing from Shilaidaho to Promothanath Chaudhuri, and Promothanath Chaudhuri later on became the husband of our Indira Devi Chaudhurani, this niece I've been talking about. Uh, he wrote in that letter that this was a moment of crisis for him because the major part of his existence was still trying to return to the days of those dreamy days when he could remain the poet only. And on the other hand, the landowner kind of a role that he was playing over there was just a role. He was not very much interested in it, but he was very sincere in whatever he had been doing. At the same time, he says that writing poetry has perforce been my lifelong intoxication. I think of completing as many tasks as possible at one go so as to concentrate on my poem at ease, in peace and seclusion. But each and every day and month arrives with its new tasks. And every month I sit down to write for Bharati, the very illustrious Bengali magazine that the family edited. He was one of at one point of time, he also edited this magazine. He sits down to write for Bharati with utmost concentration, and then he has to think of the petty details of the zamindari, and he is torn between the two activities. During this period, he was writing about the villagers. For example, I will talk about a very famous short story called The Postmaster. And this story he had written in 1891, where he was showing how, or rather, in what way an urban man might try to cope with the situation when he's put in this kind of a rural area. And we also get a vivid picture of the backwardness of such rural areas about which he could not have known much before going there. So the postmaster is something which transports us to the village of Ulapur, where a young man from Calcutta arrives as the postmaster, and what he felt was like a fish out of water in this remote village. He did not like the company of the villagers or the workers in the factory adjacent to the village. His immediate response was to seek an escape in the form of a transfer order. So he has applied for that. And in the meantime, this is the way his surroundings are described, his living conditions are described. His office and living room were in a dark thatched shed, not far from a slimy pond surrounded on all sides by dense growth. Now, soon we learn that this postmaster did not find a proper reply to his request for a transfer. And when this was turned down, he had a fever. And after he had survived, he decided that the place was too unhealthy for him to live. And he decides to resign and go away to Kolkata. But the problem is that there was a little girl who was serving as his maidservant. This girl was called Ratan. And this girl doesn't find any escape. So we find that the villagers, including Ratan, they are left to languish in that village, though the urban man can make his escape. The rural woman, the rural people, generally speaking, cannot have any escape from such a situation. And Tagore understood that. So he was drawn towards these people. And at the same time, we learn about the way in which, unless and until a very shocking incident would take place, nobody would be bothered about such villages. In general, the zamindars or the landowners would live in other parts of India or Bengal or Kolkata or England, and they would rarely visit their villages which were actually paying for their living costs elsewhere. In contrast, once Tagore understood their condition, he was trying, even through his short stories, to give the jolt which was very necessary, according to him, without the help of which the urban population would not bother about the rural people at all. So, on 30th November 1891, there was this journal which was being published. This was the inaugural issue of Sadhana, the magazine published by the Tagore family. And there, Rabindranath had published a short story called, in Bengali, it was called Khoka Babur Protyabartan. And in English translation, it is called The Child's Return. In this story, there is a judge who is transferred to a district on the banks of the Padma. As Tagore was living on the banks of the Padma, he possibly found it easier to talk about this. Now, this judge was called, he was a part of the judiciary service, so highly placed in British India for an Indian. He was called Onukul, and he was living over there on the banks of the Padma River with his wife, son, and Rai Charan, a very loyal servant. And if we read just a little small part of this short story, we would understand why Tagore was very worried. We read, then came the rainy season, and day after day the rain poured down. The hungry river, like an enormous serpent, swallowed terraces, villages, and cornfields, covering with its flood the tall grasses and wild casuarinas on the sandbanks. From time to time, there was a deep thud as the riverbanks crumbled. This is not any ordinary description of nature as he found it. The overflowing river was a rage, actually. It was raging, and it could destroy lives. And the ordinary urban man like Onukul would not pay any attention to it, but Onukul had to, because in this remote part of Bengal, the dangerous situation had to be acknowledged by the educated citizens, like one educated citizen at least, like Onukul, when Onukul's tiny son is swallowed by the river. So Rabindranath knew about certain aspects of village life by this time. 3 years later, he wrote another short story in Bengali called Megho Rodro, in English, Cloud and Sun. When in this story, we find that he is talking about other aspects of their lives, and he is taking up a stance, a very stern kind of a stance against the British Raj. He was highlighting the rural folks' affinity with the river and the exploitation that they faced because of the British magistrate, other officials, sahibs, so to say, through the experiences of a young villager. This young villager is quite well educated. He is a lawyer. And he's a studious kind of a person with very thick glasses, and he's not an activist. He's not a congressman. He doesn't have any political affiliation. He's not a social activist either. And this young lawyer, Shashi Bhushan, who sympathizes with the villagers, that is his only fault. And let's see what happens to him just because of the sympathy he feels. We find that there is this manager sahib of a new steamer line that is passing. The steamer is passing through this place. The river is there, and a few passengers were on board. And among the passengers were some inhabitants of Shashi Bhushan's village. And there was a country boat which had the audacity to race against this steamer. And the country boat is a sailboat, a simple boat. The boatman actually was not giving up very easily. So at a certain point of time, the river took a slight bend, and the boat outstripped this steamer by taking a shorter cut. It was smaller in build, and the sahib raised his revolver and fired a shot at the swollen sail. In a moment, the sail burst, the boat sank, and there was a man in the boat who was working very hard at grinding spices for cooking things, etc. He didn't have any chance to make his escape. He drowned and was lost. Shashi Bhushan rescued the rest of the boatmen. He asked for the villagers' help as eyewitnesses because he was trying to make a complaint, lodge a complaint against this sahib. The boatman himself didn't dare to do it, but with the encouragement of Shashi Bhushan as a lawyer, when at last he lodged his complaint, what did the magistrate do? The magistrate listened to the manager primarily of this steamer line. And the manager said that, uh, I mean, Tagore's comment as a narrator in the short story is, we don't know why the manager acted thus. It is difficult to say. Perhaps he felt the rivalry of an Indian sail to be intolerable. But this I know for certain, that the Englishman believed he would not be liable to be punished for this little joke. And he had an idea that the people whose boat was lost and who were in danger of losing their lives, one of them had lost his life, also could not be counted as human beings. So, when the magistrate asked him, he simply said no witnesses were required actually. The manager said that he had really fired a shot. He was aiming at a flock of cranes flying in the sky. The steamer was going around, had just turned a bend, and it was going at full speed. So he didn't really know where his bullet landed, whether a crow died or a crane died or a boat sank. He had no way of knowing. And earth and sky had so many things to shoot at. Why would he shoot at a piece worth dirty rag as such? So the magistrate believed in this, and this is the master stroke. It convinced the magistrate effectively that the manager was not really bothering to shoot at a particular poor boatman. Hmm. He need not. Therefore, uh, the case was dismissed, and Shoshi Bhushan could do nothing. Now, I would say that at this point, we see Rabindranath had the nerve to publish stories criticizing the British atrocities. Now, he could, by birth, he was a part of the illustrious Tagore family in Kolkata, very rich in one sense, highly educated, very well educated family, cultured family. Shoshi Bhushan is nobody to them, and the poor villagers could have been nobody to them as well. But Rabindranath's indignation is palpable even in translation. His narrative's tone in Cloud and Sun actually echoes how disappointed Shashi Bhushan must have been. So, acquitted on all charges, the manager Sahib went on to smoke a cigar and play whist at his club. The dead body of the man had been recovered by this time, 9 miles farther off, and Shashi Bhushan returned to his village with frustration raging in his breast. Later on, Shashi Bhushan is imprisoned for 5 years for fighting against Vansat Sahib. And that at that point of time, the occasion was that the police Sahib steamer had passed clean through a net, a fisherman's net. Now, this was a net which would have cost 700, 800 rupees at that point of time, which was a princely sum for the poor fisherman of any village. And all these fishermen had collected the money over the years, and they had made this net, and they had the permission. They were paying rent to gather the fish from that place. And they had left a channel for the steamers and other boats to pass. But the police sahib's boat actually passed straight through this, got entangled, and the police sahib, in his anger, said, cut down the net. So it was destroyed completely. Shashi Bhushan hurried to the Sahib from his boat anchored nearby, pointed out the injustice of this act, and the Sahib insulted him by using very bad words. And he actually assaulted the Sahib, and the result was 5 years of imprisonment. Nobody would listen to him, why he had done it, what kind of a protest it required, because everybody would listen to the Sahib only and not to any Indian, however educated he might be, or even if he were a lawyer or even Tagore. So Tagore actually at this point, I think, had two choices. As a member of the Tagore family, he could easily live in Calcutta or he could stay in England, and he could have had a very nice relationship with the British officials. The alternative was to keep his eyes open and think of the country not as an agglomeration of mountains, rivers, fields, meadows, beautiful places, but he was thinking of the people of the country. Now, we understand that poetic compositions inspire people in one way, but through his short stories, he was directly taking up a position against the British government. And perhaps this is why much, much later he had he had renounced his knighthood as a mark of protest of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So this is the Tagore that we are talking about, the man who, from a mere poet, a mere dreamy creature, is turning gradually towards a person who is socially aware, who knows about the rights, the responsibilities, and he also knows about what to do and how to go about it for his compatriots. Thank you.